John Moises Chakaguase Ilbis and Jocelyn Joanna Toakiza had known each other since childhood. Their connection began long before adulthood, long before independence, long before the expectations that come with growing older. They shared familiarity built through years of proximity and shared experience, the kind of relationship that rarely invites suspicion. By the time both were living in the United States, that history still shaped how they interacted. It shaped trust, it shaped access, and in June 2024, it shaped the circumstances that placed Jocelyn in a private space with someone she believed she knew. Jocelyn was preparing to turn 21. The birthday carried weight. It marked a milestone, a transition, and a moment she expected to celebrate with people she felt safe around. Plans were made for a small gathering rather than a crowded public event. An Airbnb was rented in Syracuse to provide privacy. According to court records and sentencing statements, Chakaguase Ilbis helped organize the celebration. His involvement did not feel unusual. Their shared childhood meant his presence was familiar, not threatening. On June 18, 2024, Jocelyn arrived at the Airbnb with Chakaguase Ilbis. Surveillance footage later reviewed by investigators showed the two entering together. What the police would later discover inside the rental reframed the entire night. When officers processed the scene, they found an uneaten birthday cake and unopened gifts. These details were not incidental. They showed that the formal celebration never began. No candles were lit, no gifts were opened. Whatever happened occurred before the night could become what it was meant to be. What took place inside the Airbnb was reconstructed through forensic evidence, digital records, and later admissions. At some point after arriving, an interaction between the two escalated. Prosecutors did not present a definitive argument about what sparked the violence. Even at sentencing in 2025, the motive remained officially described as unclear and unexplained. There was no confirmed dispute over money, no documented argument presented as the trigger. The absence of motive became one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. What is known is how Jocelyn died. Medical findings and court records confirmed she was killed by asphyxiation, most likely involving a ligature or an unknown object rather than hands alone. This detail mattered legally, as it indicated the use of something to apply sustained pressure to her neck. The act ended her life before the birthday gathering could begin. The night stopped before it started. After the killing, the focus of the case shifted from violence to decision-making. Surveillance footage showed Chakaguase Ilbis leaving the Airbnb later that night, carrying Jocelyn's body. He placed her into a vehicle and drove away. Prosecutors later emphasized this moment as critical. It demonstrated awareness of what had happened and a choice to act afterward rather than seek help. The crime extended beyond the act itself. Jocelyn was soon reported missing when she failed to return home and could not be contacted. Family members searched and reached out to authorities. As days passed, concern hardened into fear. On June 22, 2024, her body was discovered in Lincoln Park. The location confirmed that she had been transported from the Airbnb. The discovery aligned with the surveillance footage and narrowed the investigation decisively. Court records later revealed that Chakaguase Ilbis did not remain in Syracuse. In the days following the killing, he fled to New York City. While there, prosecutors established that he used Jocelyn's credit cards for personal purchases. This evidence was introduced to demonstrate continued, deliberate conduct after her death. It countered early claims of confusion or disorientation. During initial interactions with law enforcement and in early statements, Chakaguase Ilbis claimed he had been too intoxicated to remember what happened inside the Airbnb. Investigators documented this assertion. Prosecutors later argued that his actions after the killing, transporting the body, leaving the area, and using her financial cards, contradicted claims of complete memory loss or lack of awareness. On June 25, 2024, Chakaguase Ilbis turned himself in to police in Spring Valley, New York. Authorities confirmed that he contacted law enforcement after reporting that he had been mugged and assaulted while in New York City. His surrender ended the search and formally moved the case into the court system. He was charged with second-degree murder under New York law. The charge reflected the killing itself and the conduct that followed. The case did not depend on speculation. It was built on surveillance footage, forensic evidence, financial records, and admissions. In January 2025, Chakagwase Ilbis pleaded guilty. The plea removed any dispute about responsibility and fixed the factual outline of the case in the public record. At sentencing in March 2025, the court heard from Jocelyn's family. They spoke about her life, her plans, and the weight of losing her to someone she had trusted since childhood. Prosecutors emphasized the setting of the crime. This was not a random encounter. It was a killing that occurred in a private space chosen for celebration. The unopened gifts and untouched cake became symbols of how abruptly her life ended. Chakagwase Ilbis apologized in court. He acknowledged responsibility but did not provide a clear explanation for why the killing occurred. The lack of motive remained central. The judge noted that uncertainty while stressing that absence of explanation did not reduce the harm caused. The court sentenced him to 23 years to life in prison. The court also confirmed that after completing his sentence, he will be deported to Ecuador. If you believe these stories should be told in honor of the memory of the victims, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate the support. Thank you. As this case ends with a 23-year sentence and a future deportation, let's move directly into the second case. January 16, 2013 was the day uncertainty ended and consequence began. On that morning, investigators recovered the remains of Skylar Neese along a rural road in Greene County, Pennsylvania, just across the state line from West Virginia. For more than 6 months, Skylar had been missing. The discovery confirmed that the 16-year-old had been killed. It also confirmed something more difficult to accept. The people responsible were not strangers, but friends she had trusted since childhood. Skylar Neese grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia. She lived with her parents and attended University High School. Her world was shaped by routines that repeated daily: school, home, online conversations, and friendships that stretched back to elementary school. 2 of those friendships were with Shelia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. The 3 girls met when they were about 8 years old. Years of shared experiences built familiarity. Familiarity built trust. That trust did not require constant checking or reinforcement. It existed because of time. Parents recognized the names. Teachers saw them together. Nothing about the friendship suggested danger. Long bonds like these often feel safe precisely because they are old. History creates comfort. Comfort lowers defenses. As the girls moved into their teenage years, the structure of the friendship shifted. By 2012, court records later showed that the relationship had become strained. Arguments increased. Jealousy and resentment took hold. These changes were not dramatic or public. They unfolded inside private conversations and messages that few others saw. The friendship did not end. It tightened under pressure. Long relationships rarely break cleanly. They persist because they always have. Familiarity can make separation feel impossible, even when the connection becomes harmful. Outward behavior still suggested closeness. Inwardly, tension grew. Years of shared history kept the bond intact, even as trust eroded. This stage matters because time works both ways. It can deepen care, or it can deepen conflict. In Skylar's case, duration increased access. Access removed barriers. On the night of July 5, 2012, Skylar agreed to meet Eddy and Schoaf. In the early hours of July 6th, she climbed out of her bedroom window to join them. Surveillance footage from a Black Bear Express convenience store in Morgantown shows Skylar calmly getting into a car with the 2 girls. The image is brief. There is no struggle, no visible fear. The scene looks ordinary because it follows a familiar pattern, a teenager meeting friends she had known for years. This moment compressed the entire history of the friendship into a single act of trust. Skylar did not question the situation. She had no reason to. The same familiarity that had defined the relationship since childhood removed any sense of risk. Pattern replaced instinct. Trust overrode caution. When Skylar did not return home, her parents reported her missing. Search efforts expanded quickly. Flyers spread across Morgantown and surrounding areas. Social media campaigns gained attention. Vigils were held. Eddie and Shof appeared publicly during the search, reinforcing the appearance of shared concern. For months, the case stalled. The absence of answers kept hope alive. Behind the scenes, investigators worked methodically. Phone records were reviewed, text messages were analyzed, online activity was examined. Over time, inconsistencies appeared. Statements did not match data. Timelines failed to align. The same closeness that once reassured now raised questions. The turning point came in January 2013. Rachel Shof confessed to authorities. She admitted that Skylar had been killed and agreed to lead investigators to her body. On January 16, 2013, Skylar's remains were recovered in Pennsylvania. According to Shof's confession and evidence presented in court, Skylar had been stabbed to death during the drive that night. The violence did not occur during a public argument or sudden confrontation. It followed a private emotional collapse shaped by resentment that had been building over time. The killing happened away from witnesses, carried out by people Skylar believed were taking her somewhere safe. Trust provided access. Access enabled harm. Shof later pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. She cooperated with prosecutors and provided details of the crime. She received a 30-year prison sentence, with eligibility for parole after 10 years. Her cooperation helped close the case, but it did not lessen the weight of what had occurred. Sheila Eddy also pleaded guilty. She admitted responsibility and entered a plea to first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years, in line with West Virginia law for juveniles at the time. The court concluded that the crime was intentional and planned. As of January 2026, both perpetrators remain incarcerated. Rachel Shof was denied parole in 2023 and 2024. In June 2025, she chose to waive her parole hearing. Her next parole eligibility is scheduled for June 2026, and correctional records list her projected final release date as April 30, 2028. Sheila Eddy remains incarcerated at the Lakin Correctional Center in West Virginia. Her first parole eligibility date is May 2028. No parole hearing has yet occurred in her case. The legal outcomes closed the criminal proceedings, but they did not restore balance. Skylar's parents became advocates for missing children, focusing on how early assumptions can delay action. Their efforts led to the passage of Skylar's Law in West Virginia. The legislation revised Amber Alert criteria, allowing alerts to be issued immediately for missing children even when authorities believe the child may have left voluntarily. The change addressed a systemic gap that affected Skylar's case. Now, we turn to the third case. Being sentenced for a crime committed as a juvenile, yet tried and punished as an adult, is the legal contradiction that defines the case of Joshua Phillips. At just 14 years old, Phillips entered the adult criminal justice system, facing consequences designed for fully developed offenders. That decision, made in Florida in the late 1990s, shaped every legal outcome that followed and continues to influence how the case is reviewed more than 2 decades later. The crime that led to that decision occurred in a quiet neighborhood of Jacksonville, where Phillips and Madeline Clifton lived only a few houses apart. Their connection was not defined by conflict or distance, but by proximity and familiarity. They shared streets, neighbors, and the kind of everyday recognition that often lowers caution without anyone realizing it. In childhood environments like this, trust is rarely questioned, it is assumed. On November 3, 1998, 8-year-old Maddie was playing outside near her home during the afternoon. She was last seen in daylight, close to familiar houses and yards. When she did not return home as expected, concern surfaced quietly. Neighbors checked nearby areas. Parents walked the street calling her name. The early belief was simple and hopeful. She had to be nearby. That belief was rooted in familiarity, the idea that danger does not usually come from what is already known. As the hours passed, that belief weakened. Maddie's family contacted police, and a missing child investigation began. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking residents when they had last seen her. Volunteers joined the search. Flyers appeared. Local news outlets reported on the disappearance. The neighborhood entered a tense waiting period defined by uncertainty rather than panic. The focus of the search stayed outward: yards, streets, and nearby wooded areas. No one suspected that the answer was already hidden inside a nearby home. During this period, Joshua Phillips, then 14, was seen participating in the search. He spoke with neighbors. He walked the same streets as everyone else, looking for Maddie. To those around him, he appeared to be another local teenager responding to a troubling situation involving someone he knew. Familiarity continued to lower defenses. Shared history shaped perception. For 7 days, Maddie remained missing. On November 10, 1998, the search ended abruptly. While Joshua was at school, his mother noticed something wrong inside her home. A strong, unusual odor was coming from her son's bedroom. She also noticed fluid leaking from the base of a waterbed, something that had not been present before. Concerned, she entered the room to investigate. When she lifted the mattress, she made a discovery that immediately ended the search. Maddie's body had been hidden beneath the waterbed. Police were called, and the Phillips home became a crime scene. Investigators were stunned by the location. The search had focused on public spaces and open areas, while the truth had been concealed inside a house only steps from where Maddie was last seen. Familiarity had not just lowered suspicion, it had redirected attention away from the most critical place. Joshua Phillips was taken into custody and questioned. In his initial statements to police, he claimed that Maddie's death began as an accident. He said he struck her with a baseball bat and panicked afterward. That explanation, however, did not align with the medical findings. The autopsy revealed extensive and intentional violence. Maddie had suffered 11 stab wounds, and there was evidence of strangulation using a phone cord. These findings established that her death could not be explained by a single accidental blow. The official medical record showed repeated actions that escalated rather than stopped. The contrast between Phillips' account and the forensic evidence became central to the prosecution's case. Because of the severity of the injuries and the evidence presented, prosecutors chose to charge Joshua Phillips as an adult. Although he was legally a juvenile, Florida law at the time allowed minors to be tried as adults in cases involving serious violent crimes. The decision reflected the nature of the act rather than the age of the defendant. From that moment forward, Phillips faced adult legal consequences for actions taken as a child. The trial took place in 1999. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence, testimony about the discovery of Maddie's body, and statements Phillips made during police questioning. They argued that even if fear played a role early on, the continued violence, concealment of the body, and participation in the neighborhood search demonstrated awareness and intent to avoid responsibility. One of the most controversial aspects of the trial was the defense strategy. Phillips's defense team made the unusual decision to call 0 witnesses. No psychologists testified. No family members were called. No character or mitigation witnesses were presented. The defense relied entirely on cross-examination and arguments emphasizing Phillips's youth and immaturity. This strategy drew criticism at the time and remained a focal point during later appeals, where legal observers questioned whether the absence of mitigating testimony influenced the jury's decision. After deliberation, the jury found Joshua Phillips guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the harshest sentence available under Florida law at that time. The sentence reflected how the court weighed the severity of the crime over the defendant's age. One child lost her life, another lost his freedom indefinitely. Years later, the case returned to public attention as juvenile sentencing laws evolved. Rulings by the Supreme Court of the United States held that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles violated constitutional protections. These decisions did not promise release, but they required courts to consider whether individuals sentenced as children should receive a meaningful opportunity for release later in life. Joshua Phillips's sentence was reviewed in 2017 under these legal changes. The court acknowledged the evolving understanding of juvenile development and Phillips's age at the time of the crime. However, the judge ultimately upheld a life sentence, allowing for the possibility of future review rather than automatic parole. The ruling reflected a legal balancing act between developmental science and irreversible harm. As of January 2026, Joshua Phillips is 41 years old and undergoing a new round of sentencing reviews under Florida's juvenile resentencing framework. In mid-2025, his attorneys began preparing for a hearing connected to the 25-year milestone, which requires courts to assess whether a person sentenced for a crime committed as a child has demonstrated sufficient maturity and rehabilitation to justify a modified sentence or a meaningful opportunity for release. The review process examines institutional behavior, participation in education and rehabilitation programs, psychological evaluations, and acceptance of responsibility. Prosecutors are expected to argue that the deliberate nature of the violence and the lasting impact on Maddie's family outweigh any evidence of rehabilitation. As of early 2026, no final decision has been issued. If you've watched to this point and you've found this video interesting so far, I'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for your support. As the wait for court assessments is ongoing for a juvenile tried as an adult, the fourth case comes in. Angeles National Forest is quiet in the early hours, its creeks shallow, its trails removed from daily life. In October 1985, one such creek became the final location of a crime that did not begin there. A 17-year-old girl was found face down in the water, her body pinned beneath a heavy log to prevent her from lifting her head. The setting looked distant and remote, but the violence that occurred there was rooted much closer to home. The girl was Michelle Avila. The discovery came on October 4, 1985, just 3 days after Michelle disappeared. Physically, the case moved fast. Emotionally and legally, it did not. Michelle had been beaten. Her hair had been cut off. The cause of death was drowning, made certain by the weight of the log, estimated at nearly 100 pounds, used to hold her underwater. Investigators immediately understood this was not an accident. It was an act of control carried out by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. But knowing how Michelle died did not mean knowing who killed her. To understand that, the story has to move away from the forest and back into Michelle's life. Michelle lived in Arleta, a neighborhood in California's San Fernando Valley. She was a high school student navigating friendships that had followed her since childhood. These were not casual relationships formed in passing. They were long-standing bonds built over years, shared routines, shared history, shared trust. In those spaces, familiarity felt protective. No one thought of it as dangerous. By high school, those friendships had changed. According to later testimony, jealousy and rivalry had replaced closeness. Accusations circulated that Michelle was sleeping with their boyfriends. Whether those claims were true was ultimately beside the point. What mattered was how strongly they were believed. In the emotional world of teenagers, perceived betrayal can feel absolute. Michelle became a focal point for resentment that had nowhere healthy to go. That emotional groundwork was already in place on October 1, 1985, when Michelle left home and never returned. At first, her disappearance caused concern, but not certainty. Teenagers argue, teenagers leave, families hope, police were notified, friends were questioned. There was fear, but there was also the belief that she might still come back. That belief lasted 3 days. When Michelle's body was found in the Angeles National Forest, the question shifted from where is she to who did this. Investigators knew the crime was personal. They knew Michelle had not been targeted at random, but the case quickly stalled. No arrests were made. Leads dried up. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. For nearly 3 years, Michelle Avila's murder remained unsolved. The Avila family lived inside a suspended reality. No answers, no arrests, no forward movement. The speed of the discovery did not bring closure. It made the silence afterward heavier. During that silence, one of the most disturbing aspects of the case emerged without notice. One of Michelle's former friends, Karen Severson, moved into the Avila family home. She slept in Michelle's bed. She comforted Michelle's mother. She attended the funeral. She spoke about grief and justice. She talked about helping find the person responsible. For months, then years, she lived as a trusted presence inside the household, mourning Michelle's death. This was not momentary deception. It was sustained proximity, familiarity used as camouflage. The investigation continued in the background with little progress. Public attention faded. The case remained open but stagnant. The Avila family did not know that one of the people responsible for Michelle's death was living among them, sharing meals, offering comfort, occupying Michelle's physical space. Then, in July 1988, the stillness broke. A witness came forward, Ava Chirumbolo. Her testimony provided information investigators could no longer ignore. It aligned with existing evidence and connected Michelle's murder directly to people inside her social circle. What had once been suspicion without direction suddenly had clarity. Arrests followed quickly. Karen Severson and Laura Doyle, both former friends of Michelle, were taken into custody. The shock was immediate. These were not strangers. These were girls who had grown up with Michelle, who knew her habits, who had access to her trust. The trial exposed the emotional engine behind the crime. Prosecutors presented a case centered on toxic jealousy and high school rivalry. The violence was not framed as a carefully planned execution, but as an assault that escalated beyond control. When the jury deliberated in 1988, they made a critical distinction. Jurors stated there was insufficient evidence of premeditation. Instead, they believed the girls got carried away during the assault. That conclusion shaped the verdict. Karen Severson and Laura Doyle were convicted of second-degree murder. Each received a sentence of 15 years to life in prison. The law recognized intent and responsibility while rejecting the claim of planning. Time moved forward unevenly. Karen Severson was released on parole in December 2011. Laura Doyle followed in December 2012. Each release reopened wounds that never fully healed. But the case left one final mark beyond prison sentences. After her release, Karen Severson attempted to profit from the murder by pursuing a memoir. For the Avila family, this felt like a final violation, turning their daughter's death into potential income for the person who helped cause it. Public outrage followed. That outrage led to change. In 2015, California passed Missy's Law, legislation designed to prevent convicted murderers from profiting from the publicity of their crimes. The law exists because of Michelle Avila. It stands as a lasting legal legacy born from a family's refusal to allow exploitation to follow laws. Here, we see a convicted murderer trying to profit from their act. What happened in the fifth case? Let's find out. 8 people were sentenced for a crime that began quietly, unfolded across years, and ended with the death of a 13-year-old girl. Their cases moved through Connecticut courts at different speeds, with different outcomes, but all traced back to the same night in October 1997 and the same victim, Marianne Measles. What connects every sentence is not only the crime itself, but how long it took for truth to surface, and how silence inside a shared social world allowed violence to progress unchecked. Marianne lived in New Milford, a place where familiarity shaped daily life. On the night she disappeared, nothing stood out as dangerous. She went with her mother to the Big Y supermarket, a routine stop. Her mother expected to be inside for about 10 minutes. Marianne stayed behind, waiting in her mother's car in the parking lot. It was a decision made by countless families every day. That short wait became the last confirmed moment she was seen alive. Mary Ann did not leave with a stranger. She was approached by people she already knew, individuals from her own social circle. Their presence did not raise alarm. Familiarity worked as cover. To anyone nearby, the interaction would have looked ordinary, even harmless. Investigators later confirmed that this trust was essential to how the abduction occurred without drawing attention. The crime did not begin with force. It began with access. As the night passed and Mary Ann did not return, concern grew quickly. Her family reported her missing, and police began searching. Flyers appeared throughout New Milford. Neighbors paid closer attention to unfamiliar movement. Early efforts focused on locating Mary Ann alive. Interviews were conducted, tips were followed, and leads were checked. But the investigation soon slowed. What stood in the way was not a lack of information, but silence from those who knew what had happened. Behind that silence was a specific and documented catalyst. Investigators later confirmed that Mary Ann had been preparing to report statutory rape allegations involving men connected to the group that ultimately killed her. This fact reframes the crime entirely. The murder was not random. It was not driven by panic or confusion alone. Mary Ann's intent to report posed a threat to people who believed exposure would bring serious consequences. Her willingness to speak transformed her from a trusted friend into a perceived liability. The crime did not unfold through the actions of one person. 8 individuals were involved. Their decisions advanced together. One person's choice to stay quiet reinforced another's decision to participate. Hesitation in one moment was mirrored by inaction elsewhere. No one intervened. Responsibility spread thin across the group, making it easier for each person to continue. Escalation did not come from a single act, but from accumulation, small decisions stacking until reversal was no longer possible. For months, Mary Ann's disappearance remained unresolved. Time passed without answers. Seasons changed. The urgency of the search gave way to uncertainty, then fear. Nearly 9 months later, in July 1998, investigators made a grim discovery. Mary Ann's body was recovered from Lake Lilanona, a large body of water spanning several Connecticut towns. She had been wrapped in a blanket and weighted with chains before being placed in the lake. The concealment showed planning and coordination. It confirmed that this was not an accident, but a deliberate effort involving multiple people. Even with the recovery of her body, the case did not immediately move toward justice. The investigation stalled for years. Fear, loyalty, and self-preservation kept those involved from speaking. Each person had something to lose. Silence became a form of protection, not just for individuals, but for the group as a whole. The truth existed, but it was contained within a closed circle. That silence finally began to fracture in October 2002, 5 years after Mary Ann's murder. Members of the group started cooperating with investigators. Statements began to align. Details overlapped. What had once been hidden behind fragmented stories became clearer. Arrests followed, marking the first real shift toward accountability. Prosecutors confirmed that the motive was tied directly to preventing Mary Ann from reporting sexual abuse and that the crime was carried out collectively. Because several defendants were young at the time of the murder, the legal process unfolded across both juvenile and adult courts. Each case moved forward separately, but together they formed a single record of responsibility. As of 2026, the status of the perpetrators reflects both their roles and their choices after the crime. Keith Foster is serving a 110-year sentence. He was the only defendant who chose to go to trial, and the verdict reflected the full scope of the evidence presented. Alan A.J. Walter, identified by prosecutors as the ringleader, is serving 60 years without the possibility of parole. Ronald Rajcock was originally sentenced to 36 years, but his sentence was increased to 42 years on appeal because he acted as the driver who abducted Mary Ann from the parking lot. Deaneric Dupas is serving a 47-year sentence. Jeffrey Boyette Jr. received a 50-year sentence, suspended after 25 years. Dorothy Hallis is serving 25 years. June Bates Seeger is serving 30 years and was denied early release in 2020. Maggie Mae Bennett, the eighth individual, received a 15 to 20-year sentence due to her cooperation with investigators and was released from prison in 2019. Taken together, these sentences show how cooperation, silence, and timing shaped accountability. Some spoke early, others did not. The consequences followed those choices. The courts established that Mary Ann's death was not the result of a single decision, but of a series of shared actions that advanced together without interruption. 8 people were sentenced for a planned crime against a teenage girl. How many defendants should we expect in the 6th case? Let's get into it. Heidi Broussard and Megan Firamusca had known each other for most of their lives. Their friendship began in childhood in New Braunfels, Texas, stretching back to their early years and continuing, in uneven but persistent ways, into adulthood. It was not a friendship defined by constant closeness. Instead, it was shaped by familiarity, shared history, and the kind of recognition that comes from growing up in the same place. By the time they were adults, that history carried weight. It created comfort, it created trust, and it reduced suspicion. As adults, their lives moved in different directions. Heidi built a life in Austin, Texas. In 2019, at 33 years old, she was preparing to become a first-time mother after a pregnancy that came with complications. By the time her daughter, Margot Carey, was born, Heidi's world had narrowed to recovery, feeding schedules, and the constant demands of a newborn. Her energy was limited. Her focus was fixed on survival and care. During this period, Megan Firamusca moved closer again. Old friendships often resurfaced during major life changes, and this did not initially feel unusual. Megan traveled to Austin during Heidi's pregnancy and accompanied her to appointments. After Margot was born, she continued visiting. She helped inside the apartment, she held the baby, she offered support when Heidi was exhausted. To Heidi and her family, this involvement felt safe. Megan was not a stranger, she was someone Heidi had known since childhood. That long history translated into access. Heidi's family trusted Megan enough to give her a key to the apartment. There was no visible tension, no reported conflict. The relationship appeared stable and supportive. This was the first stage of escalation: trust. At the same time, Megan Firamusca was living a separate and hidden reality. Investigators later confirmed that she had been telling people in her own life that she was pregnant. Friends believed her. Some thought she was close to giving birth. Medical records showed there was no pregnancy. The claim was false, but it had been repeated often enough to become embedded in her daily life. As Heidi transitioned into motherhood, dependency quietly formed, though in different ways on each side. Heidi depended on help because she was physically recovering and caring for a newborn. Megan, according to prosecutors, depended emotionally on the role she had created for herself. Being close to Heidi and the baby reinforced the false identity she was presenting to others. The relationship was no longer balanced. One side was living reality, the other was protecting a lie. This imbalance fed resentment. There were no known arguments, no outward signs of hostility. Resentment grew internally. Heidi had something Megan wanted. Heidi's life was moving forward in a way that did not center on her childhood friend. The baby was not symbolic. She was real. And that reality threatened the story Megan had built around herself. Control followed, but it did not appear as force. It appeared as involvement and access. Megan had a key. She could come and go without resistance. Her presence did not raise alarms because it was backed by years of familiarity. Control was quiet, wrapped in trust and routine. Digital evidence later revealed how deeply this fixation had grown. In the month leading up to the murder, Megan Firamusca searched Heidi Broussard's name online 162 times. The frequency was not casual. It reflected obsession. 2 days after Heidi disappeared, Megan searched for bodies found in Austin, Texas. These searches were later presented as evidence of premeditation and awareness. On December 12, 2019, Heidi Broussard and her newborn daughter disappeared. Messages stopped. Calls went unanswered. When family members checked the apartment, there were no obvious signs of forced entry or struggle. Heidi's car was still there. Margot's belongings remained inside. The scene suggested departure rather than violence. Police were contacted and a missing persons investigation began. Officers retraced Heidi's recent contacts and movements. Attention shifted toward people with access, those whose presence would not raise suspicion. Magin Firamuska quickly became a person of interest. Fear of loss emerged as the driving pressure behind the evidence investigators uncovered. Megan had driven Heidi's car on the day of the disappearance. Her false pregnancy claims surfaced in interviews. Her online search history revealed fixation before the crime and awareness afterward. Prosecutors later argued that Megan believed the collapse of her lie was imminent and that losing access to the baby meant losing the identity she had constructed. Evidence showed that Heidi Broussard was killed in the Austin area before Megan left the city. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death as ligature strangulation. Heidi did not survive long after her disappearance. After killing her, Megan placed Heidi's body in the trunk of her Nissan Versa and drove to Houston. On December 19, 2019, 7 days after Heidi and Margot were last seen, police located Megan Firamuska in Houston, Texas. During a traffic stop, officers found baby Margot alive and unharmed inside the vehicle. The discovery brought immediate relief, but it also confirmed what investigators feared. Heidi was not with her child. Shortly afterward, Heidi Broussard's body was found in the trunk of the car. The emotional rupture, the final stage, had already occurred. Megan Firamuska was arrested and charged. The legal process took several years. In February 2023, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 55 years in prison. Under Texas law, she will be eligible for parole after serving approximately half of that sentence, around 27.5 years. The sentence closed the legal case, but it did not restore what was lost. As of 2026, Margot Carey is being raised by her father and surviving family members. She survived the crime, but she will grow up without her mother. Now we turn our attention to the 7th case. 4 houses apart, 2 families lived on the same quiet stretch of road in St. Martin's, Missouri. The distance was short enough that it barely registered as distance at all. Children moved between yards without ceremony. Faces became familiar through repetition, not conversation. In that narrow gap between front doors lived a sense of safety built on routine. Nothing about those 4 houses suggested that one of them would become central to a case studied years later. On October 21, 2009, Elizabeth Olton, 9 years old, stepped outside her home believing she was heading towards something ordinary. She had grown up on those streets. She knew who lived where. She recognized the people she passed. Elizabeth often spent time with neighborhood children, including the younger siblings of Alyssa Bustamante, a 15-year-old who lived just 4 houses away. Their connection was not built on closeness or shared secrets. It was built on proximity. That was enough to feel safe. St. Martin's was the kind of place where danger was assumed to come from elsewhere. Adults watched for unfamiliar cars, not familiar faces. Children were warned about strangers, not neighbors. That mindset shaped how the afternoon unfolded. Elizabeth left her house without hesitation. No one followed. No one questioned the decision. The walk was short. The setting was known. When Elizabeth did not return home, concern did not begin with fear. It began with small explanations that felt reasonable. Maybe she stayed longer than planned. Maybe she stopped to play. Family members checked nearby yards and streets. Time passed. The explanations grew thinner. Neighbors joined the search. Law enforcement was called. The absence of answers changed the mood without pointing toward a clear cause. Search efforts expanded beyond immediate yards to nearby areas, including wooded land close to the neighborhood. The landscape itself offered no warning. The trees stood still. The paths looked unchanged. When Elizabeth's body was found the following day, uncertainty ended abruptly. The question was no longer where she was, but how this had happened. The investigation narrowed quickly, not outward toward unknown threats, but inward toward people already inside Elizabeth's daily life. Law enforcement began retracing Elizabeth's final movements carefully. Who had seen her last? Who knew where she was going? Who had been nearby? These questions were asked without accusation. They narrowed the field of possibility, step by step. The answers did not point to a stranger passing through town. They pointed closer. The realization did not arrive with shock. It settled gradually as the scope of uncertainty collapsed. Attention turned to Alyssa Bustamante. There was no dramatic confrontation that announced this shift. No sudden revelation that explained everything at once. Instead, evidence accumulated quietly. Investigators discovered journals written by Bustamante. The entries described planning before the crime occurred. The writing did not reflect confusion or loss of control. It suggested thought placed ahead of action. These journals became central to the case, not because they explained motive clearly, but because they demonstrated intent. The violence itself was never framed as spectacle. It did not need to be. Elizabeth had been led into a wooded area close to her home. What happened there ended her life. The setting remained ordinary. The outcome did not. The lack of noise or public display made the reality harder to accept, not easier. Nothing about the place announced what had occurred there. Bustamante was arrested and charged as an adult. Prosecutors cited the evidence of planning and the seriousness of the act. She initially faced first-degree murder and armed criminal action. At 15, she entered a legal system designed to measure accountability over decades. The transition from neighbor to defendant happened quickly. As the case progressed, explanations were handled with restraint. Prosecutors focused on what could be proven rather than what could be speculated. The defense raised Bustamante's age, mental health history, and unstable upbringing. During questioning, Bustamante stated that she murdered because she wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. The statement did not provide clarity or comfort. It confirmed intent without offering a reason that made sense to others. The legal outcome took shape through negotiation rather than trial. In 2012, Bustamante entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. The plea was part of an agreement to avoid a first-degree murder conviction, which in Missouri carries a mandatory sentence of life without the possibility of parole. The agreement did not lessen the seriousness of the crime. It changed the structure of the sentence. The court imposed a life sentence for second-degree murder, along with an additional consecutive sentence for armed criminal action. The sentences were ordered to run one after the other. Parole eligibility did not signal leniency. It established a distant point of review rather than a promise of release. The sentence reflected both accountability and the reality that the defendant was a minor at the time of the crime. Years passed. The sentence remained. As of 2026, Alyssa Bustamante remains incarcerated in Missouri. She was denied parole in July 2024. Her next parole hearing is scheduled for 2029. Because her sentences run consecutively, her earliest potential release is projected around the year 2059. Parole review does not guarantee release. It allows reconsideration under strict standards. Dangerous fantasy was the motive for the seventh case. What could be the motive for Case 8? Let's find out. The motive came before the meeting, before the park, and long before the courtroom. In the murder of Brianna Gay, the court later determined that two different internal drivers converged into a single, planned act of violence. One defendant was motivated by a sustained fascination with killing and cruelty. The other was motivated in part by hostility toward Brianna's gender identity, a factor the judge formally treated as a hate crime. These motives were not discovered through guesswork. They were established through evidence, language, and behavior examined in detail during trial. Understanding motive matters because it explains why this crime did not erupt suddenly. It did not begin with anger in a moment. It began with thoughts repeated over time, reinforced privately, and shared between peers. Psychology becomes relevant here before any physical escalation. Adolescents are still forming moral boundaries, but that does not mean they are incapable of intent. When harmful ideas are rehearsed, written, and validated, they can harden into purpose. In this case, different motivations fed into the same outcome. Obsession aligned with prejudice, fixation aligned with hostility. Only after understanding motive does the rest of the story take shape. Brianna Gay was 16 years old, living in Warrington, England, moving through the everyday world of school, messages, and friendships. At that age, peer relationships carry enormous weight. Friends are not just companions, they are reference points for safety and belonging. Trust is often extended based on familiarity, not caution. This is not a flaw, it is development. Brianna's decisions reflected what felt normal for a teenager relying on peers. From a sociological perspective, youth violence rarely grows in isolation. It develops within small social environments where ideas circulate without challenge. Language shifts first. A person becomes discussed as an object rather than a human being. Group reinforcement reduces hesitation. These patterns do not announce themselves loudly. They operate quietly, often unnoticed by adults. In Brianna's case, harmful thinking developed within a peer dynamic that appeared ordinary on the surface. On February 11, 2023, Brianna agreed to meet two acquaintances in a public park near Warrington. Public parks are symbols of openness and safety. They are shared spaces associated with visibility and community. Sociologically, choosing such a location lowers perceived risk. Meeting peers there feels routine. Nothing about the setting suggested danger. The meeting fit neatly into the pattern of teenage social life. What Brianna could not see was that the meeting had been planned with the intent to kill her. Messages exchanged beforehand later showed preparation rather than spontaneity. This is where escalation becomes clear. Psychology distinguishes impulse from planning. Impulse acts in seconds. Planning requires time, repetition, and internal agreement. By the time Brianna arrived, the decision had already been made. Forensic evidence later confirmed that Brianna was stabbed 28 times with a hunting knife that had been brought to the scene by Eddie Ratcliffe. The weapon was not improvised. It was carried deliberately. This detail was central at trial because it demonstrated preparation. The act was not chaotic. It followed intent formed earlier. The second defendant, Scarlett Jenkinson, was found by the court to have been driven by a fascination with violence and killing. The judge described this as sadistic interest, not confusion or immaturity. This finding was based on evidence presented in court, including language and behavior that showed sustained preoccupation with harm. The court was careful in its wording. Motive was identified only where evidence supported it. Sociologically, the convergence of these two motives is significant. Different internal drivers can reinforce each other within a shared plan. One person's fixation can normalize another's prejudice. Together, they can override hesitation. This does not require adulthood. It requires reinforcement. When harmful beliefs are shared, they feel less extreme to those holding them. After Brianna was killed, investigators reconstructed events using digital records, location data, and witness testimony. The timeline showed coordination between the two defendants. This mattered legally because it separated planning from panic. The investigation did not rely on speculation. It relied on evidence that demonstrated structure. When the case reached Manchester Crown Court, legal insight entered the narrative fully. In December 2023, both defendants were found guilty of murder. Because they were under 18 at the time of the offense, they were initially protected by anonymity. This protection reflects legal recognition of developmental science. However, the seriousness of the crime required a different balance. In February 2024, reporting restrictions were lifted, and the defendants were publicly named. During sentencing, the court addressed motive directly. Jenkinson's fascination with killing and Ratcliffe's hate-based hostility were both weighed. The judge treated the transphobic element as an aggravating factor, formally recognizing it as a hate crime. Legal reasoning does not exist to explain psychology. It exists to assign consequence. This was the point where analysis ended and judgment began. Both defendants received life sentences with minimum terms set by the court. Their age was acknowledged. The brutality, planning, and motive were emphasized. This is how law responds to harm. It does not soften facts. It structures consequence. A further legal development followed nearly a year later. In December 2024, Eddie Ratcliffe sought to appeal the length of his minimum term. The appeal was rejected. The court upheld the original sentence, confirming that it properly reflected the seriousness of the murder and the hate-based element identified at trial. This update did not change the outcome. It reinforced it. Diving directly to the ninth case. Childhood friendships often unfold in plain sight. They grow on short streets, around schoolyards, and inside buildings meant to protect children, not frighten them. In Newcastle upon Tyne in 1968, those ordinary settings framed a series of events that would later force Britain to confront how easily warning signs can be misunderstood when they come from children. Mary Bell was still legally a child when the first death occurred. On May 25, 1968, she strangled 4-year-old Martin Brown inside an abandoned house in the Scotswood area of Newcastle. That date matters. It was the day before Mary Bell's 11th birthday. Some records, therefore, describe her as 10 at the time of the first killing, while others refer to her as 11 when discussing the period as a whole. The distinction may seem minor, but it shaped how adults perceived her. 10 sounded incapable. 11 sounded closer to responsibility. That single day sat between disbelief and recognition. At the time, the dominant reaction was disbelief. An abandoned building suggested accident. A young victim suggested misadventure. The possibility that another child had deliberately caused the death felt incompatible with prevailing ideas of childhood. Police explored options, but suspicion did not land where it needed to. Mary Bell was questioned briefly, then returned to her routines. Familiarity settled back in. Mary's behavior in the days after Martin Brown's death did not fade quietly. It drew attention, but not urgency. She visited Martin's mother and asked if she could see him in his coffin. The request was deeply unsettling to the grieving parent. Yet even this moment was processed as inappropriate curiosity rather than danger. It was labeled disruptive, a word that would follow Mary repeatedly. The emotional posture of adults remained the same, disturbed but unconvinced. Between the first and second deaths, a more explicit signal appeared. Mary Bell and her close friend Norma Bell broke into a local nursery school. Inside, they vandalized the building and left handwritten notes. These notes did not clearly identify Mary by name. Instead, they were signed with crude aliases, including Fanny and Faggot, and written in childish, mocking language. One of the notes referred to Martin Brown's death. This detail mattered. The notes did not read like an adult confession. They read like something police expected from children trying to shock. When officers encountered them, they were dismissed as a tasteless prank, exploiting a local tragedy for attention. The aliases and crude wording reinforced that belief. The idea that a real admission of responsibility could be hidden inside such childish language did not register. Once again, disbelief overrode interpretation. The nursery itself became a powerful symbol. A place meant for safety and early learning was violated, not only physically, but symbolically. Notes tied to a child's death were left where toddlers learned their first words. Childhood spaces were being used to express something far darker. Yet the setting worked against urgency. Because it was a nursery, the act was framed as childish vandalism, not a warning. Mary and Norma continued to spend time together. Their friendship followed patterns that looked ordinary from the outside. They walked the same streets, they talked, they stayed close. Shared time and shared language are normal in childhood friendships, and that normality acted as camouflage. As summer moved on, the absence of decisive action created a dangerous calm. Martin Brown's death had not led to accountability. The coffin visit had not triggered intervention. The nursery notes had been dismissed. Each signal existed on record, but none altered belief. Childhood was still assumed to be a barrier against intent. On July 31st, 1968, that belief collapsed. 3-year-old Brian Howe was killed near Wasteland close to the same neighborhood. By this point, Mary Bell had turned 11. The setting echoed the first case. Open ground, nearby homes, spaces children passed every day. This repetition forced recognition. 2 deaths, similar locations, similar circumstances. What had been unthinkable after the first death became unavoidable after the second. Mary Bell was present during the events surrounding Brian Howe's death, again with Norma Bell. Investigators re-examined everything that had come before. The nursery notes were no longer pranks. The aliases were no longer jokes. The coffin visit was no longer dismissed as curiosity. Behaviors once described as disruptive were now seen as part of a pattern. The arrests shocked the public. Newspapers struggled to describe what had happened without language that felt impossible. The court system faced the same problem. Mary Bell was charged with 2 counts of manslaughter, not murder. The court accepted that her responsibility was diminished, shaped by severe neglect, instability, and emotional harm from early childhood. She was convicted and sentenced to detention at Her Majesty's pleasure, a sentence with no fixed endpoint. Norma Bell was also tried in relation to Brian Howe's death. Despite her involvement in earlier behaviors, including the nursery break-in, the jury acquitted her. The evidence did not establish that she carried out the killing. The verdict highlighted a difficult truth about childhood dynamics. Proximity and influence do not always translate into equal responsibility. 2 children can share actions without sharing outcomes. In later years, psychologists and legal scholars revisited the period between the deaths. They focused on the warning signs that had been visible but misread. The nursery vandalism, the crude notes using false names, the visit to a grieving mother. None of these acts were hidden. They were interpreted through belief systems unprepared to accept what they suggested. Mary Bell spent 12 years in secure institutions. Reports documented the extent of her early neglect and emotional damage. These findings did not excuse her actions, but they reframed them. What had once been seen as bad behavior was now understood as something far more serious. In 1980, she was released under a new identity. Courts later granted her lifelong anonymity, recognizing the risk she faced if publicly identified. And now, to the last case. June 22, 1954, began as an ordinary winter day in Christchurch, New Zealand. By the afternoon, it would become one of the most examined crimes in the country's history. On that day, Pauline Parker, aged 16, and Juliet Hume, aged 15, killed Pauline's mother, Honora Parker, during a walk in Victoria Park. The act itself took minutes. What led to it had taken years. Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume had met as schoolgirls in the early 1950s. Pauline was introspective, physically fragile, and socially withdrawn. Juliet was articulate, imaginative, and self-possessed. Their friendship formed quickly and deepened with unusual speed. They spent most of their time together, often excluding others. They wrote stories and poems, filled notebooks, and spoke in shared language that shut out the world around them. Over time, their bond narrowed until it became the central structure of their lives. Both girls carried private pressures into that relationship. Juliet's childhood had been unsettled by illness and separation. At the age of 8, she was sent to the Bahamas for health reasons, living away from her parents for an extended period. She was not hospitalized there, but the distance shaped her emotional independence and reliance on imagination. Pauline's home life appeared stable, yet it was emotionally complex. Her younger sister, Rosemary, had Down's syndrome and lived in a special care home, returning to the family mainly on weekends. Pauline's sense of responsibility and strain developed quietly, without drawing attention. Together, Pauline and Juliet created a shared inner world. It was detailed and ordered, filled with invented kingdoms, characters, and systems of power. In that world, they were important and admired. Ordinary life felt diminished by comparison. School felt restrictive. Adults felt intrusive. The fantasy was not a temporary escape. It became the place where meaning resided. Pauline's diary shows how consistently this imagined world replaced everyday reality. Adults around them noticed the intensity but struggled to define it. Teachers saw intelligence mixed with isolation. Doctors later observed emotional dependence. Parents became increasingly uneasy. By late 1953 and early 1954, separation was discussed as a corrective measure. Juliet's parents considered sending her overseas again. Pauline's parents worried about her health and emotional balance. For the girls, separation was not understood as temporary or protective. It was experienced as an existential threat. Most of what is known about this period comes from Pauline's diary. The language shifts over time. Early affection becomes certainty. Loyalty becomes absolute. Opposition becomes personal. Problems are no longer obstacles, but barriers. Juliet's later reflections added another perspective. As an adult, she stated that Pauline had spoken of ending her life if they were forced apart. This claim does not appear in Pauline's diary, but it shaped how Juliet later interpreted the events. What remains clear is that both girls viewed separation as intolerable. By mid-1954, their private logic focused on one figure, Honora Parker. Honora was cautious and protective. She questioned the influence Juliet had over her daughter and supported medical advice suggesting distance. In the shared reasoning of the girls, this resistance became decisive. Their writings show discussion and agreement. The plan did not arise suddenly. It developed through repetition and reinforcement until it felt settled. On the morning of June 22, 1954, Pauline Parker, Juliet Hume, and Honora Parker went for a walk in Victoria Park. The setting was public and unremarkable. Other people were nearby. Pauline carried a handbag. Inside it was a brick placed in a stocking prepared in advance. During the walk, Honora Parker was attacked and struck repeatedly. The injuries were fatal. Afterward, Pauline and Juliet ran to seek help, saying Honora had fallen. Medical examination quickly established that the injuries could not have resulted from an accident. Police questioning followed. At first, the girls repeated their account. Physical evidence contradicted it. The weapon was recovered. Attention turned to Pauline's diary, which was examined in detail. The diary outlined intention, anticipation, and shared resolve. It showed awareness of consequence and acceptance of it. The language did not indicate confusion. It indicated certainty. This written record became central to the investigation and later to the trial. It removed ambiguity about planning and shared purpose. The trial later, in 1954, drew national attention. 2 teenage girls stood accused of murder. Psychiatric testimony explored emotional dependence and shared belief. The concept of a shared mental state, often referred to as folie à deux, was raised to explain how 2 people can reinforce distorted thinking in one another. The court considered this evidence carefully. It did not accept that the girls were unable to distinguish right from wrong. Preparation, concealment, and written intent demonstrated understanding. Another element that attracted attention was interpretation of the girls' relationship. Prosecutors and commentators suggested romantic involvement, based on diary language and psychological theories common at the time. Decades later, Juliet Hume rejected that interpretation. She acknowledged the intensity and exclusivity of the bond, but denied that it was physical. This disagreement has never been conclusively resolved. The historical record supports emotional dependence. Physical involvement was never proven. In August 1954, Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume were convicted of murder. Because of their ages, they were sentenced to detention at Her Majesty's pleasure, meaning they would be held until authorities determined they could be safely released. They were imprisoned separately and forbidden from contacting each other again. Over time, both were released under supervision and given new identities. Their lives moved in different directions, but the event that bound them remained fixed. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to my channel.